Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those of you connecting today. A warm welcome to this webinar on racism in the academy, global perspectives on multiple forms of racism and struggles for equity. On behalf of the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, IESALC, University of Bath, International Center for Higher Education Management, University of Bath's Race Equality Task Force, and Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero, UNTREF in Argentina. We thank you very much for joining this webinar. So just a reminder to our panelists, you can keep your microphones off when you're not participating. We also take the opportunity to announce that the event has simultaneous translation between English and Spanish. Si necesita traducción al español, por favor activar el botón en el menú inferior para español. And a very warm thanks to our interpreters today, Elena Pavan Macias and Maria Perino. So again, colleagues, a reminder that this event is being recorded. Later it will be released on the UNESCO IESALC YouTube channel, and we will send you all the link to the recording. We are also excitingly planning to create a podcast from this webinar, which will be a novelty for IESALC. And with that, you'll be able to take your learning with you wherever you go. So my name is Emma Sabzalieva. I'm the moderator for today's webinar. I'm a senior policy analyst at UNESCO IESALC, and I lead on a range of projects, including the futures of higher education, new forms of student mobility, and academic freedom. I have a background in comparative and international education policy, which I've pursued through research, teaching, policy analysis, and higher education administration. But the stars of the show, who it's now my privilege to introduce, are today joining us Professor Daniel Mato and Professor Rajani Naidoo. So Professor Daniel Mato is Principal Investigator for the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research, CONICET, and Director of the UNESCO Chair in Higher Education and Indigenous and Afro-descendant Peoples in Latin America at Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero, UNTREF, in Argentina. Professor Mato chairs the Initiative for the Eradication of Racism in Higher Education in Latin America. He has published extensively in the fields of cultural diversity, racism and higher education, and culture, communication, and social transformation. Professor Rajani Naidoo is UNESCO Chair in Higher Education Management, Director of the International Center for Higher Education Management, and Head of the Race Equality Task Force at the University of Bath in the UK. Before this, she contributed to an alternative higher education institution that was set up as a model for transformation in post-apartheid South Africa. Her publications and research projects focus on the escalation of competition, audit, and bureaucracy in higher education, and the contribution of universities to inclusive development and social justice. So this webinar came about at Rajni's suggestion, and it's been a great pleasure to work with both Rajni and Daniel over the past few months to develop this important event. I think we all have a lot to learn from these esteemed scholars who are leaders in their fields and who've also championed initiatives to bring about positive change across a range of international contexts. So today we're going to examine the multiple ways in which intersectional racism operates within higher education across national contexts. We'll also highlight some inspirational examples of movements, policies, and strategies to overcome racism, and start to outline some key tasks for the present and for the future. So with all that in mind, let's now begin our conversation with Daniel Mato and Rajani Naidoo. I'm going to ask both of them some questions, pass them the floor in turn to provide their responses. And for those of you who are participating from all around the world, we welcome your questions in the chat box. You can post these either in English or Spanish as you prefer at any time. And towards the end of the webinar, we will take up as many of those questions as we can. So let me start by asking Daniel and Rajni, based on your experiences, could you tell us about how racism is manifested in different societies? Daniel, the floor is yours. And you'll need to unmute now.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. Many thanks for setting up this webinar, especially to IESALC, but especially to Emma and the team who has worked so hard. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, also particularly with my colleague Rajni. I'm having some troubles of connection. Could you please confirm, are you hearing well my words?
We can hear you well, thank you.
Thank you. Well, Emma, thank you very much for your question. I have begin by saying that in Latin America, racial discrimination does not only affect indigenous peoples and persons of African descent. Romani, Jews, Muslims, and other population groups are also targets of racial discrimination. However, indigenous peoples have not only been affected through racial discrimination, they have also endured every form of racism. Since the very beginning of the European invasion, as just a few years later, it has begun to affect enslaved African persons. We need to differentiate between racism and racial discrimination. Racism is both an ideology and a regime of power that is constitutive of the modern world and of every American society, involving its political and economic organization. Racial discrimination is one of the manifestations of racism, the more evident, but not the only one. The expression structural racism is usually employed to highlight the historical foundational character of racism and its economic and political relevance. It is in this sense that we affirm that racism is a regime of power. This regime of power pervasively affects persons and communities of African descent and indigenous peoples, which happens in specific ways in each country. Histories and situations vary from country to country, also between diverse regional contexts within each country, and concerning the cases of particular communities and peoples. Nevertheless, beyond those differences, some commonalities are meaningful. In Latin American societies, racism has been so naturalized that most of the population often limits the usage of the concept of racism only to explicit facts of racial discrimination. This reductionist operation, combined with the generalized ignorance of the role of racism in the origin of all or most social inequalities, often keeps hidden both how it permeates specific institutions and is reproduced through them. The naturalization of racism explains why the majority of the population is not outraged when indigenous peoples' communities are displaced from their ancestral territories to secure the businesses of agricultural, mining, and urban development corporations. Similarly, this naturalization explains why the majority of the population is not outraged to see that these communities do not get their claims on the matter fairly treated by the justice, nor does it get angry to see that their protest for this unfairness of the justice system get violently repressed. The naturalization of racism also explains why the majority of the population finds just normal that these communities do not get fair access to health, public housing, water, or education. So the situations vary from country to country, region to region, people to people, but this is, generally speaking, the prevalent situation. Thank you. I'm finished. I don't know if I pass the word to Rajani. Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you very, very much to Emma and Niels and our translators and the whole team for the huge amount of background work that they've done, invisible work to make all of this happen. And it's really so exciting to see so many people from many different countries. And it has been an absolute joy to get to know Daniel and his work. So I'm really, really happy, very excited to be here. I agree very much with Daniel and what he has said, and I would only like to add to that to say something about the link between racism and capitalism. So I want to use the concept of racial capitalism that was developed in the 1970s by South African exiles, including people like Martin Legasic and Neville Alexander. What they were arguing is against the idea that as capitalism developed, apartheid in South Africa would fall away. So there was apartheid in South Africa. The world was calling for a boycott of South Africa to dismantle apartheid. And many people were saying, no, allow capitalism to develop. As capitalism developed, apartheid would fall down. And what they showed with their work was that this actually would not happen. What they showed was how the system of apartheid legalized starvation wages. It made legal very dangerous working conditions for people of African heritage. And what did this do? This attracted the multinational companies into South Africa, the mining companies, the gold and the diamond companies. And this led to very, very rapid economic growth. So South Africa, in the context of Africa, became a powerhouse for economic growth resting on apartheid. Cedric Robinson in England, when he was studying here, took this analysis further. And what he said was South Africa was not just a very different case. Actually, this happens in many, many countries. What he showed was that actually the fact that the market and capitalism will increase diversity is a complete myth. He showed us, together with Stuart Hall, how capitalism intensifies difference. It manufactures difference across race, across gender. It racializes people. It divides people over religion, sexuality, everything that it can, in order to allow for super exploitation. And we already know that racialized indigenous communities that are fighting against agribusiness and all the other big companies that exploit our planet are positioned by neoliberal governments as being backward communities. These are communities, they say, that need modernization. These are communities that need to enter the market system. And actually, what is happening is that those communities are being destroyed and the planet is being destroyed. So if we look across countries and if we look across over time, we can really chart the ways in which neoliberalism develops new racial contours, new ways to develop new inequalities, which feeds capitalism. And together with this, what we get is violence, real violence to police borders. And here I'm talking about both real borders and abstract borders. And these borders are always related to color, culture, religion, gender, sexuality, citizenship, and are economic as well. I pass back to Emma.
Thank you both very much. I think what we're doing here is starting at this, sort of societal macro level. So I really appreciate you both bringing in these points for us to help us think about the manifestations of racism sort of more broadly, and giving these examples sort of from Latin America and South Africa, as well as in more global context. So if we continue this line of thinking, Daniel, let me follow up with you. So you published an article in 2020. It talks about the multiple forms in which racism is expressed in higher education. So, with that as the sort of object of our analysis today, can you talk a little about how you understand this idea of the multiple forms in which racism operates in higher education?
Thank you, Emma, for your question. Before answering, I would like to say something about Rajani's words, which I value very much. The perspective she told us is very acute. And as she stated, this not only happens in South Africa, it's currently happening in different ways all throughout the Americas. But there are some countries in America which are having very difficult troubles, and we many times are not aware of this. I'm talking particularly about one of the colonies that still are in America, French Guiana. And what is happening in French Guiana regarding mining and the situation of the communities and ecological destruction is horrible. But France is smiling to the world in international fora, but they still have that colony. And it's not the only colony in the Caribbean and not only in America. And I'm not going into those subjects, but I think we must keep all this in mind to have very much into account what Rajani has told us also apply to many other areas all throughout Africa, Asia, and America. Well, I'm going to Emma's question. Please excuse me, Emma, to get back to Rajani's words, but I think it has been useful. Okay, regarding the multiple forms of racism in higher education, some naturalized forms of racism are rooted in non-explicit restrictions that impede Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples from gaining entry and graduating in higher education. Economic disadvantages and admission exams are outstanding problems for both groups in most Latin American countries. Nevertheless, admission and economic problems are not the only obstacles that Afro-descendant indigenous students must face in higher education. Most of them often must deal with linguistic differences and educational disadvantages originating in the lower quality of their primary and secondary education opportunities. This latter problem is particularly acute when these communities are based in rural areas. We have many studies that document what I'm stating now. This is not the moment to kind of recite an academic paper, but there are lots of references that show this. Another form of racism is the exclusion in the curriculum of the worldviews, histories, languages, epistemologies, knowledge systems, and learning modalities of Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples. Remarkably, this sort of exclusion contrasts with the increasing recognition for their wise managing of water and land resources vis-a-vis the contemporary ecological crisis. These exclusions are usually accompanied by the scarcity or even the absence of indigenous and Afro-descendant teachers. These problems are a result of the absence of affirmative action programs combined with the policies of recruitment and promotion based on criteria that do not value their own language skills or their knowledge. All these exclusions have an impact on the education of all students, whether or not they are indigenous or Afro-descendants. Nevertheless, in the case of indigenous and Afro-descendant students, they operate as factors of estrangement and denial of their existence that affect their educational trajectories. Again, we have numerous studies showing this. Another form of racism is the existence of gaps between the acknowledgement of educational rights of these peoples in international instruments and national constitutions, and their lack of recognition or insufficient recognition in higher education laws and policies, as well as in institutional regulations and practices in universities. So all these forms configure the way in which racism affects higher education. It's not just a matter of racial discrimination, as is usually assumed. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And I really appreciate the clarity of the response in helping us think through, as you mentioned, not just sort of, let's say, more obvious discrimination that we see happening, but the systemic issues that are underpinning in higher education. Let's continue to examine these connections between racism and higher education. Earlier this year at IESALC, we published a report on the futures of higher education. It's called Thinking Higher and Beyond, Perspectives on the Futures of Higher Education to 2050. In fact, Rajni was also involved with this report. So while that report looks ahead to higher education in 30 years or so from now, it also notes the need to, and I quote, critically engage with and interrupt the harmful legacies that are still present in today's systems, most urgently those stemming from colonial trauma, but also resulting from other inheritances. So could I ask you both to talk about this historical role of higher education and also the current ways in which higher education naturalizes and reproduces racism? Rajni, let's turn to you first, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to, maybe I'll refer to South Africa in this case, but as Daniel was talking, I was so struck by the connections and the challenges. And of course, each country, each continent, each region, each sub-region is very, very different, different context, different history. But what's amazing and interesting about this conversation with Daniel and with Emma is how we can also see the connections. So I think the reason that I want to refer to South Africa is because South Africa, initially, it appears as if it's an extreme case. But actually, I think when you look closer, it encapsulates in a more visible way what has become more invisible in other countries, particularly in the West, in high-income Western countries. So I want to use South Africa as an extreme case to really look at dynamics elsewhere as well. So if we look historically, in the 1950s, when the Afrikaner government developed apartheid, South African universities, actually before apartheid, South African universities were already racially segregated under British rule. Just like the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in the United Kingdom, which did not allow women, which did not allow Jewish people, which did not allow people of color to attend. The first universities established by the English in South Africa were closed to people of color. What we then had, of course, was the apartheid government, which segregated universities by law. And so you had a hierarchy of universities. You had white universities that were very highly resourced, high status, independent from the government. Then you had Indian universities for people of Indian heritage, although our ancestors came from India in the 1860s. People were still designated Indian. Then people of mixed heritage, which were designated as colored. and then people of African heritage. And you had this kind of racial hierarchy of universities, all with a descending order of resources, status, etc. And so the South African legacy is very, very stark. And what we see in the post-apartheid era is that one of the first things that Nelson Mandela's government did was they set up a committee to transform higher education in South Africa. So in the post-apartheid era, South African policymakers, students, staff and researchers all worked very hard to transform the system, and they achieved significant success. As academics and researchers, we're sometimes very critical. We're always looking at what hasn't been achieved. But I think in the case of South Africa, a lot has been achieved, and we should really celebrate that. But just like slavery and the decades of racism in the UK and in the USA and other countries, the legacies of the past in South Africa are still present. Recently, students and academics have shown us that there is still much work to be done on institutional racism, and that there is still a lot of work to be done on decolonizing the curriculum. But I think the biggest issue is that while now we have more Black middle-class students in higher education in South Africa, Black working-class students are still excluded. And I want to turn now to the work of a really amazing young man, Makuuve Masuta, who I had the privilege of supervising his thesis, and I learned so much from it. So he himself was a student that came from a rural area, and he had to either sink or swim in a higher education system that was not set up for him. What he did in his research was he drew on the life histories of poor Black students from rural areas. And he showed us how many mountains these young people had to climb to actually enter university. And these were mountains of finance, of hunger, of violence. And once they were in university, they were more or less left to sink. And Makuuve has a very nice a metaphor to show us this. And he says, it is as if a young Black person from a working class background comes into an area and he's thrown into a swimming pool, and he or she has to compete against other students. The other students, mostly middle class, white and Black, have grown up with swimming pools in their gardens. They have swum from a very, very early age, and they are like a fish in water. While the Black working class students have never been taught to swim. They've never seen a swimming pool, and their parents have not seen a swimming pool. So for them, university is a very alien environment, and all the cultural capital that they bring into the university is completely devalued. It's not just not recognized, it's devalued. They told that they talk too loudly. They're shown that they dress differently. Just everything is completely wrong. And so I think studies like that tell us a lot when you really look at the lived experiences of people. And Makuuve shows how some of these students actually succeeded against all the odds. So I would say that, you know, as the work of Pierre Bourdieu shows us, the traditional notions of meritocracy, of standards, and of excellence, which are divorced from conditions of disadvantage, actually legitimize and naturalize racial inequality. And Daniel has shown that so well in what he said as well. And I think what is very clear for me is that from Daniel's work, from other people's work in Southern Latin America, in the Caribbean, and in Africa, there's so many policy innovations that we can learn from. And I think our problem in the West is that we always look to the so-called world-class universities in the USA and the UK for lessons. And actually the real lessons are kind of occurring under the surface in ways that are still invisible. Thank you. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Danielle. Can I pass the floor to you?
Yes, but I am still beginning by commenting some of Rajni's words, which I appreciate very much. I very much like her analysis. And I would like to point out two things with regard to her comments. First is that what Rajni's told us take us to the need to differentiate between the idea of equality and the idea of equity, and of inequality and equities. And many times this is omitted, and many people takes both for the same and think that, well, everyone is allowed to swim in the swimming pool. The trouble is that for someone, this is the first occasion. And same happens with the education system at large, not only with higher education. This is one of the things that I would like to comment regarding Rajni's words. But the other one is that, yes, I agree. Not only most universities in Europe and the US look at each other among themselves, but also many Latin American universities always look towards those countries and universities, and many times forget to collaborate among them. Although in Latin America we have many experiences of collaboration at the regional level. But in any case, I would like to highlight that something very powerful is happening currently in many universities in the US, which is related to the so-called critical race theory. The discussion that people under the flag, let's say, of critical race theory is promoted in US universities, as well as in the educational system at large, is very important. And I think we have many things to learn from. And also to keep an eye on the reactions of the, let's say, conservative sectors, racist sectors in the US, because there are at least 10 states at this moment in the United States that already passed legislation to avoid the eruption of critical race theory in the schools, not in universities. Well, this was to comment on Rajni's work, but going into the question Emma asked me directly. Throughout the Americas, racism, massacres, and genocide policies are not only a problem of the colonial period. Moreover, in some countries, they have increased in the post-colonial period. Since the colonial period, higher education has played a significant role in the naturalization and reproduction of racism. Higher education can and should actively engage in democratizing our societies, contributing to repairing the harms of the past and the inequities of the present. Higher education can play a significant role in changing this story, since teachers and higher education graduates are formed in higher education. It also graduates of higher education it is also graduates in higher education who develop teaching materials, run the schools, formulate educational policies. And those who carry out historical research are also graduates of higher education. So this puts higher education in a very powerful place to change the story. Nevertheless, to have an incidence in interrupting the naturalization and reproduction of racism, we need the knowledge about the harmful legacies of our problematic past to reach the entire population, not just be concentrated in the training of professionals. We need to make that knowledge be available and promote critical reflections beyond classrooms and books. We have to develop public communication campaigns and engage in collaborative relations with other social agents. This work about racism is as necessary and legitimate as the job our institutions do about nutrition, health, ecology, or other public interest matters. Racism is not something just to add to the work of higher education institution. It has to be in the very center. There are numerous institutional programs and networks of colleagues developing diverse public communication initiatives to educate the general population or specific audiences about those harmful legacies and against racism. And I would say one of the targets for us, among the most important, are the political parties and the people who lead the political parties, the parliament members and the executive members, because that ignorance of the general population about this harmful past and the inequities of the present also affect these people who take so important decisions. Nevertheless, it is still much to do because most of these programs and initiatives are underfinanced to get enough incidence because the issue is not truly appreciated and put into the place it has to have. On the other hand, some of these initiatives, and this is also a problem, only focuses on racial discrimination, missing out on less visible forms of racism, those others I was telling before. An example of beyond the academic communication work is the collaborative networks with grassroots Afro-Brazilian and other anti-racist organizations, diverse church groups, some local state agencies, and other social agents developed by Afro-Brazilian studies centers based in over 100 universities. They call it NIABs, Nucleus, the Afro-Brazilian studies. In Argentina, similar practices are part of the work of chairs and research centers that specialize mainly in indigenous peoples at over 20 universities. Comparable work is also developed by diverse university units in many Latin American countries. Many of these initiatives also have an increasing presence on social media, and some even in the mainstream media. We are increasingly trying to place op-eds in mainstream newspapers with middle success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. I hear a lot about the real efforts that need to be taken to sort of ensure and develop this kind of wider spread understanding of the phenomenon of racism in the multiple ways it shows up, even though it's sort of seems so glaringly obvious in so many ways. In fact, these inequalities and these connections from your responses, you can hear that they stretch not only across time, between history and today, but across places. And one perhaps very obvious iteration of this is the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's fairly well established. It is well established that this, pandemic has exposed many of the broad racial and intersectional inequalities across societies, which were there before, and making it even more difficult, perhaps, for policymakers to actively turn away from them. Rajni, could you offer perhaps some examples of these interrelations between these issues and focus for us, if you can, on how they connect in higher education?
Maybe just to say that, I think all the work that Daniel has done on multiple forms of racism, etc., very much comes into our understanding of how the pandemic both offers us hope, but also shows us so very many dangers. So maybe to start with, on the one hand, I think looking at the UK and other countries as well, there has been just amazing work done by our National Health Service, by the doctors, the nurses, and the other workers. They've shown courage, they've shown resilience, they've gone to work when they're exhausted, they've put themselves in danger. And I think the important thing about that is that a lot of people in our National Health Service come from minority ethnic communities, and they have been working under conditions where resources have just been taken away from them. And the infrastructure is crumbling. And this is in a high income country, which is kind of absurd. And often, rather than being thanked, people who are from ethnic groups in the National Health Service are told to go home, are told that they are merely immigrants, or they've placed under conditions where there are visas and huge numbers of barriers. And so now the UK has a huge shortage of nurses because of really bad macro policy. And I think one of the things that the pandemic shows us is how people can come together in solidarity. And when our National Health Service called for volunteers from the public to support them, within 5 days, they recruited 750,000 volunteers. So my hope is that actually, I hope that the solidarity and the mutual care that is coming out of this pandemic will continue into the future. But on the other hand, the pandemic has really reinforced racism. There is increased racism against people of Chinese heritage, including by government leaders who keep referring to a Chinese conspiracy. In addition, communities that are racialized, that are poor, that are immigrant, or that are indigenous, that are dispossessed, have been scapegoated. Rather than acknowledging that communities that are forced to live in poverty, to work for starvation wages, and that have inadequate nutrition, sanitation, and healthcare are more vulnerable to the virus. The blame for the virus and for the spreading of the virus is laid at their feet. So I think in a way, the pandemic has really exacerbated and reinforced racism all over the world. Secondly, the need for lockdowns and quarantines in response to COVID-19 has been exploited by some governments. Governments are using the pandemic to really ramp up repression in territorial disputes. They are criminalizing democratic protests, for example, protest against fossil fuel, and they are placing refugee communities in terrible danger. In addition, lockdown measures are imposed on the poor without taking any account of the need for food, water, or shelter. And I want to now really just echo the words that Daniel Mato has written. And he has written, "Washing your hands can be a pipe dream when you have no access to running water. Staying at home can be a folly when you live in an overcrowded slum, and strictly unnecessary when you live in the middle of the mountains." And yet what we see when such protests against hunger and pain are shown by these communities, they are met with extreme police violence. For example, in South Africa, residents in informal settlements were facing water cannon and rubber bullets. And when we come to universities, I think one of the things that I can say is that I've really felt very proud that universities, including my own, have supported local communities during the pandemic and have developed very important innovations in responding to COVID. But at the same time, of course, all the existing inequalities that we see in so-called normal times get totally exacerbated by the pandemic. When we move students to learn and teach online, the vast digital divide becomes very apparent. And we also know that in countries with very unequal and stratified university systems, the least well-resourced universities, the universities that recruit the most disadvantaged students, will be the first to fall. And I think universities have also played a somewhat ambiguous role in relation to the COVID vaccines and the global good. So we know that university researchers have been really crucial in developing the COVID-19 vaccines, but they have partnered with large pharmaceutical corporations for production and distribution. And this has led to vaccine apartheid, where poor countries have no access to vaccines, while rich countries have had the first dose, the second dose, and we're now all waiting for our booster shots. And I think it's telling that universities that have been so crucial in developing the vaccine with public money are so silent when reverse engineering of the vaccine by low-income countries has been prohibited, and when low-income countries are being forced not to open up production units to develop the vaccines. And I think this COVID situation really gives us an opportunity to think more about how we can protect research that is publicly funded to benefit humanity as a whole. Thank you, Emma. Thank
you, Rajni, for covering so many of the sort of different aspects that I think this pandemic is bringing to the fore. I'd like to sort of try to turn our attention a little bit to some kind of concrete steps that higher education can take. And I saw there was a question in the chat that was along a similar line as well. So perhaps if I could ask you both now, can you think or can you talk a little bit about some strategies or initiatives that are generating real action for positive change in higher education? Perhaps Daniel, you could take the floor first, and then we'll ask Rajni to add her interventions. Over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. It's a very important question, and it's closely related to some of the comments on the chat. I'm particularly reading now here that is written in Spanish, where Marcus Vinicius from Brazil, regarding my comment of the critical race theory in the United States, make reference to the important work that is being done in Brazil. In fact, it is my plan to talk about the work in Brazil, particularly because it's very important. It's not the only country where, but it's very important because of a long struggle of the Afro-Brazilian movement, but also because of some advancements that were gained as a consequence of certain policies that Lula da Silva, ex-president Lula da Silva, President Dilma Rousseff has established. The way is, I have a confusion with the image in the video. I'm not sure whether it is my camera on. Yes, it is.
Yeah, everything's good.
Okay, thank you. Well, the issue is that, yes, I absolutely agree with the comment on the chat. I highlight the case of the critical race theory in the United States because I usually speak mainly about Latin America, and in Latin America we have a very important work, a collaborative work between people of over 15 countries permanently, and particularly with people of Brazil. The comment on the chat talk tells on the work, for example, of Lelia Gonzalez, which is very important, Milton Santos, but I would also highlight the work of our colleague Silvia Almeida, which is extremely important, of an international projection. It's being translated into English and Spanish this year. Well, in any case, in Brazil, certainly, the governments of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff established several federal affirmative action programs, which through the assurance of slots and economic aid made it possible a considerable increase in the entry and retention of indigenous Afro-descendant students. This, in fact, apart from other consequences, have reinforced something that has many years happening before, which is the fact that in over 100 universities in Brazil, these centers I made a reference later, before, which are managed by Afro-Brazilian scholars, combine research, teaching, and the production of educational materials with interventions in educational policies and the struggle against racism, even beyond universities. This is very, very, very important work that tells also our Latin America a way of working. In a few other countries, indigenous peoples organizations, I'm talking on Latin America, or about Latin America, in a few other Latin American countries, indigenous people organizations have created their indigenous intercultural universities, their own. Examples of these kinds are the University of the Autonomous Regions, the Autonomous Indigenous Intercultural University in Colombia, the University of the Autonomous Regions of the Nicaraguan Caribbean Coast in Nicaragua, and 4 small Mayan universities created in Guatemala. By the way, not to limit myself only to Latin America, I would say that there are important experiences in this regard also in New Zealand and Canada. And we have language barriers that impede us many times to collaborate, but we have to make that effort. Although from a state-centered intercultural perspective, some states have also established their intercultural universities. Universities of this kind currently exist in Mexico, 12, in Bolivia, 3, and in Peru, 4. Concerning your question about our initiative for the eradication of racism in higher education in Latin America, I would first specify that this is a program that was launched in 2018 by our UNESCO chair, Higher Education, Afro-Descendant, and Indigenous Peoples in Latin America. As part of this particular initiative, our chair has built an international institutional coalition that currently includes over 40 universities in 12 countries and a proactive team of collaborators from an equal number of countries, with whose support we already launched 2 campaigns for the eradication of racism in higher education in Latin America. These campaigns have included over 100 seminars and roundtables, and they have also included the production of numerous, over 100 perhaps también also, videos and publications. I must acknowledge that the building of such an ambitious initiative is the most recent chapter of a series of large projects that began in 2007 as the Program on Cultural Diversity and Interculturality of IESALC, the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, our host today. Many thanks. In addition to this origin, this Institute of UNESCO has also backed particularly our initiative for the eradication of racism, which also received the support of UNESCO's participation program and of the Unión de Universidades de América Latina y el Caribe, UNTREF. As part of the initiative for the eradication of racism since 2018, our UNESCO chair has produced more than 70 microvideos, published 2 collected books, 20 short papers to reach wider audiences, and about 10 op-ed pieces published in, let's say, mainstream newspapers. In December of 2020, our UNESCO chair, last year, our UNESCO chair launched a campaign, this time at Argentine level, to promote an amendment of the Argentine law of higher education to ensure the educational rights of Afro-descendant indigenous peoples, which are in the Constitution, but not in the higher educational law. This law amendment proposal has already gained the support of the Argentine's 60 public universities and is currently under the consideration by the National Congress. We hope it will get approved. Many thanks. I think I pass the word to Rajani. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start by just echoing something that Daniel said about critical race theory from the US and also from the UK and other countries. And I think in a way, actually, the scholarship that has emerged, the scholarship and the practice and the political movements, the movements of solidarity that emerge from countries like the US, and I'm thinking about, you know, from the civil rights movements to all the way to Black Lives Matter, it's kind of even more difficult in a way. And Daniel, I've just been thinking about it as you were talking, because when I was in South Africa, there was a whole community of like-minded people, a lot of people, a lot of researchers. We had the mass democratic movement, which consisted of teachers and doctors, nurses, mine workers, who all came together to oppose apartheid. And many, many academics worked within that. And when we look at, for example, some states in the US, researchers are working under very difficult conditions. In a sense, they're working in a very alienating environment, and they're working in a very hostile environment where there's legislation against anti-racist works. So I think, you know, Daniel's kind of remark about the importance of the work coming from the US and the UK in terms of anti-racism is really important for us to add to this conversation. And I think all of that work makes, it just really generates, Emma, what you were asking for, real action for positive change. And I think, you know, if I think about the context now, I would say that the Black Lives Matter movement has made a huge difference. It's built up on other movements, the anti-fascist movements, the anti-racist movements that have been around for a very, very long time, the Anti-Fascist League in the UK. And the Black Lives Matter movement has kind of given all these movements more energy, and it's come up again. And one of the reasons now why so many universities in the UK are taking the issue of racial equality so seriously is because of these wider movements of solidarity. What actions do I feel can generate real change? And I think I want to go back to talk about my very first job when I came straight out of graduating from university. I worked in a higher education institution called Kenya. This was during the apartheid era, and it was funded by the Scandinavian governments. And basically, Kenya wanted to challenge the apartheid higher education system, and it wanted to create a model for a post-apartheid system. At that time, this is in the late 1980s, early 1990s, students were talking about boycotting education. Students were basically saying, we will not enter school, we will not enter university until we have one person, one vote. And what Kanye said is, it's not, and the slogan at that time was liberation before education. And what Kanye said is, no, the slogan should be education for liberation. So we were talking about bringing young people back into connection with education and allowing them to work with us to transform society. And for its time, it was a very alternative model. So we selected Black students of African heritage, and we selected them based on their community involvement and their interviews. So we didn't look at school grades because, of course, if you have an unequal school system, you're not going to get good grades. We changed the curriculum. So instead of, for example, doing English literature, which all universities did, even though they were in South Africa, all you learned was Shakespeare and Chaucer. You never learned anything about your own continent. We developed a course on African literature. And we changed the way we assessed. Students have to work with a community organization. They learned philosophy, etc. And the students did absolutely brilliantly. They came from really impoverished backgrounds, and they went to the most elite universities, and they did very well. And so what I would like to draw from there is just a few lessons. And I think the first lesson for me is that we were so young. So we had expertise in our subject area, but we were so young, and we had no formal teacher training. So we didn't come into the classroom with preconceptions. We really had to listen to the students. We had to listen to their experiences. And in a way, we co-constructed a curriculum. And we really worked with students to achieve. And I suppose, in a way, what I'm saying is that instead of saying to the students, you have to change to fit our university, we said, we can see you. You are visible to us. We will change to fit you. And that was, for me, is a really powerful learning that I have taken into other areas of my work as well. And at the present time, I'm a co-director of the International Center for Higher Education Management. And what we try to do in the center is to draw on different disciplines to look at how universities can contribute to a global good. And we have many research projects, including one on racial justice with a university in South Africa and a university in Colombia. We also have a doctoral program which brings in university leaders from all over the world, from more than 50 countries. And the main thing about that program is we don't teach management and leadership like a technical skill. What we teach is that you, as leaders of higher education, have to be ethical leaders. You have to understand about social justice. You have to understand how universities can contribute to sustainability and the climate emergency. And we hope that that enculturation, the fact that the students on that program live and work with students from from 56 different countries, that a lot of peer learning takes place as well. And finally, maybe a kind of much more local way of talking about real action is at our university, we've developed a race equality task force, and that's been instituted by our Vice Chancellor, and he's thrown all his weight behind that. So it really makes a difference in universities what leaders do and don't do. Sometimes leaders are neutral, sometimes they oppose it, and I would say we then have to work around them or over them or against them. In our situation, we're quite lucky. But I think the learning there for me was I could have created a very, very small little team of people. So, 10 people, made it very lean, did a very performative way, ticked a few boxes, and suddenly I have a report. And I decided to go very, very big. I think we have probably the largest task force in the world. And I've included students and the Students' Union and staff from all areas of the university, hundreds of advisory groups, etc. And that's really paid off, because people have been so committed to the particular work that they do in a certain area that we gaining huge learnings on decolonizing the curriculum. So the mathematicians and the physicians and the kind of chemists are talking to the sociologists, which barely ever happens in a university, in relation to how to change the curriculum and how you can't have a one-size-fits-all for all the curriculum. We talking about how to report racism, how to support victims of racism, and anti-racist trainings. So I think there's a lot we can do at the local level. There's a lot we can do nationally, and there's a lot we can also do in terms of our research.
Thank you both so much. And, participants, there's this wonderful kind of dialogue going on in the chat function as well. So I can see a lot of peer support and peer learning that's happening sort of in parallel to this beautiful conversation. So I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we're going to turn to some of the questions that we've received either in the Q&A or in the chat. And just sort of being mindful of the time, I think if it's at all possible for people, we'll run to about 40 past, whichever hour it is where you are, which is just a few minutes longer, I think, than anticipated, as we started a little after the hour. So this final question, and I hope people who are listening in today have also sort of heard about this. So UNESCO is going to be bringing together a very wide range of stakeholders for a major international gathering next year. This is the World Higher Education Conference. It's taking place in May, both in person and in hybrid format. This is the third time that UNESCO has done this. It sort of happens every 10 to 15 years, something like that. So one of the objectives for this conference is to create a roadmap for higher education globally and the run up to Agenda 2030, which is, as colleagues will know, the ideal date by which the Sustainable Development Goals will be achieved. I'd like to ask Rajni and then Daniel, what would you like to see on this roadmap in relation to the eradication of racism and struggles for equity in higher education?
I'm really, really worried about the fact that neoliberal governments, big transnational companies, and racist movements are all fostering divisions amongst exploited and disadvantaged communities. So, for example, now in the UK, the gap and the conflict between white and black working class young people is being widened and widened. And they do this by really manufacturing fear and spreading disinformation. So I think as a world, we are in a very highly volatile global context with threats of violence everywhere and a climate emergency. So one of the things that I would like to see is a focus on how we can protect the university from a type of market fundamentalism. How does the university protect itself from being another for-profit private enterprise? And how we can renew the university as a space for global dialogue so that we can discuss solutions to race, gender, class, and other injustices, and how we can link it to issues of sustainability and climate justice.
Rajni, thank you. Danielle, are you hearing us well?
I cannot listen. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hear me?
Yes.
Please, are you hearing me?
Yes, we can
I
hear
cannot
you.
listen.
Oh, I'm
So,
sorry
but
about that.
I remember what was Emma's question. So answering to Emma's question, but I cannot hear. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
Well, first, to subscribe part of the words, I managed to listen from Rajni's answer, but then we get interrupted. I think the World Conference, thinking from Latin America, I think the World Conference should adopt the recommendations issued by the Third Regional Conference on Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, held in Cordoba, Argentina in June 2018. These recommendations have been endorsed by more than 5,000 conference participants, including ministers and secretaries of education or higher education, depending on the cases, rectors, presidents, and other university authorities, student federations, teachers' unions, unions of other higher education workers, and experts in the field from all over the region. This regional conference emphasized that higher education is a public social good, a universal human right, and a duty of the states. It highlighted that these principles are essential to guarantee human rights without any social, gender, ethnic, religious, or age distinctions. Higher education policies and institutions must proactively contribute to dismantling all the mechanisms that generate racism, sexism, xenophobia, and all forms of intolerance and discrimination. It is necessary to promote cultural diversity and interculturality on equitable and mutually respectful conditions. I'm just reading the recommendations of the conference, are not my words. The challenge, this list of recommendations, is not just to include members of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in higher education, but to transform higher education to ensure its social and cultural relevance, to be relevant to the societies. These changes must ensure the incorporation into higher education of the worldviews, values, linguistic systems, epistemologies, forms of learning, and institutional designs of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples and other discriminated social groups. Other two recommendations. It is essential to promote and facilitate the learning of the languages of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples and their effective use in teaching, research, and extension practices. Finally, the last recommendation of the regional conference in that regard was the training of bilingual intercultural teachers must be a priority duty of higher education. These are the recommendations of the regional conference. As I said, I cannot hear currently, so I will try to connect from another computer with perhaps where's camera, but perhaps I managed to hear. Thank you.
Okay, unfortunately, Daniel doesn't hear what I'm going to say, which is that we'll allow him some time to do that. So I, again, would like to thank the panelists for these, really thoughtful and deep responses. But while they've, kind of taken us through the systemic issues that we need to think about, some of the perhaps philosophical issues, actually, they've also provided some very concrete examples about strategies that can be taken to overcome racism in higher education, or concrete examples of continuing issues that we still need to work harder on. And I think those are very much appreciated. So while Daniel works on his audio, Rajni, can I raise one of the questions that we've had in the Q&A from Marcus? Thank you, Marcus. So the question is, what is your view on how we can articulate other knowledge exchange networks of centers considered peripheral, such as Latin America, African countries, the Middle East, to better distribute scientific knowledge coming from what has become commonly called the global South? which I would often use little quote marks for as well. So let me ask you for your responses to that question, please.
That's a really brilliant question. Thank you very much, Marcus. I think there are so many barriers to doing this. Firstly, it's just cultural. We've used to seeing certain dominant centers of knowledge as in a very hierarchical way. And sometimes this is also very subconscious. For example, if we look at global rankings, and often we portray the North as forcing the South, again, using Emma's quotes, to kind of subsume to global rankings. And actually, when you look at it, it's not true. You know, senior leaders, for example, in South Africa, in other parts of the world, in India, really push their universities to fit the template that global rankings and world-class universities impose on other universities. So it's I suppose we have to think about how do we overcome those very deep structural and cultural barriers. And it's difficult because when I look at younger researchers in Britain, they are forced to publish in certain types of journals. If I look at my own school, we have a Association of Business Schools list. And the top journals in that list are mostly journals that are quantitative, that are more positivistic, and that are mainstream from America. And the way in which young people publish determines whether they pass probation, whether they get promotion, and so on. So somehow I think we have to, as colleagues who are more established, who can afford to take more chances with their career, we need to kind of get out of that mindset and look for alternative ways to value the work that we do. And my experience is, as soon as you actually start the research with, you know, so-called peripheral centers, and you see the important work that is happening, you see how amazing it is to bring together different types of theories, different types of science, how important indigenous knowledge is to our current climate emergency and sustainability, that itself takes on a life of its own. And you get so excited with the research that kind of creates its own momentum. So I think we just have to find a way to overcome these barriers that are placed before us.
Thank you. And if I may just add to that before I turn to Danielle, whose audio I think is now back. A lot seems to come down to the choice in which the ways in which we name things, you know, label things, and those labelings, which are designed, I think, on the one hand to be helpful, actually are very restrictive, because, you know, we're just to take global North and global South as one of the examples. I'll just sort of put that thought there. Daniela, welcome back. Thank you for so calmly responding to this. Let me raise another question that we have here in the Q&A, also from Marcus, who's been very keen. So I do want to put this question forward to you. He'd like to hear from you, please, Danielle, more about the protagonism of researchers from Indigenous and diasporic Black communities, about global research agendas and knowledge exchange circuits. So the question is, how can we broaden the recognition of other knowledge and productions to place themselves as subalternized science, answers to the great local, regional, or even global questions?
I'm not sure to rightly understand the question, and I don't know where it comes from. It happens, as in part Rajani has commented on the cases she knows, that most of the work some of us, or many of us do, are not always visibilized in the media that has the largest impact. But in the case of Latin America, we, and I was trying to explain, have created an international coalition from our UNESCO chair to launch the initiative for the eradication of racism, in which have been involved teams from over 50 universities up to now, in 2 years, involving the participation of at least 200 colleagues, some of them students, some of their colleagues who are teachers, and I would say about half of them are indigenous and Afro-descendants. This is not shown on the New York Times, but it's in our networks, and in fact is always highlighted by IESALC, our host today, for those who are not familiar with the name of the institute. And also, I would say I began this work from IESALC in 2007, and we managed to impact the recommendations of the Regional Conference on Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, held in Cartagena de Indias in 2008, and again in 2018 in Cordoba, Argentina. This work is circulating in the web, but there are also many publications. From IESALC, we produce 4 books. Since 2014, from my university, Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero, we have organized 6 international colloquia and published 6 books. In all these colloquia and in all these books is the work of many indigenous and Afro-descendant colleagues. And we have coordinated special issues of journals. The journal of IESALC, again, Educación Superior y Sociedad, it is usually published in Spanish with many articles in Portuguese, sometimes in English too. And we have included in that special issue of Educación Superior y Sociedad articles by indigenous and Afro-descendant scholars. We have coordinated recently an issue of Universidad, the journal of the Unión de Universidades de América Latina. All the articles are written by Afro-descendant and indigenous scholars. And we also have coordinated a special issue of the journal Integración y Conocimiento, Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, which also included this kind of articles. And I'm going to tell you a primicia. I don't know if primicia is the word in English, an advance in the news. In the second issue of Educación Superior y Sociedad, the journal of IESALC, of the year 2022, next year, we will have for the first time in that journal, and I would say in any comparable journal, an article about higher education in Latin America written by a Mapuche colleague from Chile, Maribel Mora Curreal, which will be published in Mapudungun, the language of the Mapuche people, and translated into Spanish for those who do not read Mapudungun. So we are advancing. The trouble is where this can be seen and where cannot. And this is related to what Rajni has told us. But the trouble sometimes is what access we have to certain journals. Fortunately, academic journals in all throughout Latin America, in Spanish and in Portuguese, are open access for anybody. So anybody who wants to find literature on these matters only have to put certain keywords and find them. And if one goes to the section where it comes the information about authors, one can find information about whether it is or not an Afro-descendant or indigenous scholar. I'm just mentioning those cases I know very well because I'm directly involved, so it's all in the top of my head. But there are many other cases that are not in this moment in the top of my head after the communication problem. But there are many other efforts that have been done from Mexico, from Colombia, from Ecuador, from Chile. The trouble is communication. And I think IESALC is in this sense a resource for all of us because usually publishes information about these advancements. Many thanks. I don't know whether I adequately understood the question and whether I answered what was expected.
Well, thank you both. And again, I just want to be a little respectful of people's times. There's several more questions, but I would like to try to put maybe two more forward if we can. And also, if I may add, thank you for mentioning our journal, which in English is Higher Education and Society, or ESS. We use the Spanish acronym. I'm very excited to learn about the article you mentioned. We'll also have a special issue coming out in 2022, which is focusing on the topic of mutually inclusive internationalization in higher education. So it's another aspect of higher education, which is struck by dimensions of equity and inequity, which connects with work that we're also doing at the Institute, looking at ways that we can harness technology to expand access to international opportunities in higher education. So I think that connects slightly to one of the questions which came up as well. I have a question here which I think can go for both of you, but if one prefers to answer it, it's completely fine. So the question which was received in Spanish, and I thank my colleagues for helping me, we talk about interculturality and languages. So here again, we should harness technology to work for benefit, to help us make these communications possible. And I think we can really see that in operation today. So how to decolonialize or de-racialize when many universities here in Latin America don't have Indigenous or Black professors. And I imagine I can speak from the context I'm here in Canada that it's a similar situation. So it's not a context only for Latin America. And subsequently, the questioner asks when our organic or homegrown intelligentsia that comes from our communities is suffocated and not recognized as science. I think that's a nice question because it speaks to some of the topics that have come up. So perhaps if both of you would like to make a very short response, we'll try to fit in one more question before we finish. Rajni?
Daniel? Oh,
yeah. Oh, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Go first.
Go ahead. Should I?
Yes, you first.
Okay, it's a very important question. It's a very good question, and that's why I commented earlier that the good thing that has happened in Brazil, particularly, is that I don't remember exactly since when. I think it's the 70s. There exist in Brazilian universities have been increasing since the beginning. Those centers that in Brazil are named as NIABs, Núcleos de Estudios Afro-Brasileiros, NIAB is the acronyms, which are run by Afro-Brazilian colleagues. This work, which has several decades, was reinforced thanks to those affirmative actions as a federal policy, the only federal policy in this regard all throughout Latin America, that was established successively by measures taken by Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff. But this is still insufficient because this trouble has at least 4 centuries, depending if we count on, or 5 centuries if we count from the colonial period, or just 2 centuries, I'm being ironic, obviously, since the republics. So to recover all that time, it takes a lot of time. It is insufficient, the advancement up to now got in Brazil, which is perhaps in this sense the more advanced case. but it's going on. In the case of Argentina, we are struggling to get the higher education law changed precisely to be able to establish that sort of policies. Because, in fact, yes, it is not possible, it's just a fiction, to decolonize and de-racialize the curriculum if we don't have colleagues coming. It's not just a matter of biology, it's a matter of the life experiences of people. It's not the same if you come from the upper classes than if you come from the so-called lower classes in the economic sense of upper and lower. And this is not only for the case of racialized populations, but also not so racialized populations. And I think, and I have insisted on this many, many times, we who are struggling against racism have a lot to learn from feminist and other women movements, struggles against patriarchy, or patriarchy, I think it's in English, I'm not sure. We have to work in all fronts. In the same sense, Rajni mentioned before education for liberation. We have to change the higher education institutions. We have to transform the laws. We have to transform the policies. And at the same time, as part of this, we have to gain the access of these colleagues into the universities. And also, we have to increase the engagement of universities with these communities, but because the only source for learning doesn't come from professors and doesn't come from books. It comes from experience, and those experiences are very, very important. And we have to change the conception of classroom learning.
Great.
It's a very old-fashioned concept.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Rajni?
Yeah, just to add to agree with everything that Daniel says. And I think we have to change what's valued in the university. It's not just that the knowledge that's being suffocated, which is a wonderful word that the person used, but the people that come in from these communities are suffocated themselves within our neoliberal universities.
Thank you. We are unfortunately going to have to wrap up, but perhaps we'll have opportunities in the future to continue. But let me end with this. It's perhaps a comment, but if there's anything you want to respond to, the person says, I was struck by Rajni's comment on the work of universities in the global south, leading the way in addressing racism in the academy. How can universities in the global north listen, partner to learn? It seems to me that we need a global solution to a global challenge.
I would say that's a really wonderful question to end with, because I think that universities in the north have to be less arrogant, less kind of enmeshed in their own status, in their status in relation to traditional academic journals, etc., and have to be really open to thinking in a different way, to communicating in a different way, and to seeing the problems of the world, not just from the lenses of the North, but also from the lenses of countries that are really grappling with some very, very major problems and are developing incredible solutions to do that. And that also means that universities and countries in the South have to really turn themselves to Southern experts for the support, for the research, etc. Every project that I have worked in, where we work in collaboration between the North and the South, at the end, it almost feels like, because the funding for the research project comes from the North pulls the strings, the North has the final say, and Southern partners allow that to happen as well. So I think there needs to be a much more Northern partners need to be less arrogant. Southern partners need to really push for more power, and I think that will happen, and that will be for the benefit of all researchers everywhere.
Perfect, thank you, Rajni. Danielle, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, indeed. First of all, I like once again to subscribe Rajni's words, but I also would like to put Rajni as an example in this case. Please excuse me, Rajni, if you feel ashamed, you can just cover your face. I think Rajni is an example in at least two dimensions. First, Rajni is a South African person, which I think it puts her as part of the global South. I'm being ironic, definitely it has. But she's in a global North university. This is an example itself, but moreover, she's leading a task force for racial equality in her university, and perhaps more important, because I think there are not many examples of this kind, she's leading a higher education program which train people to work in higher education, which has an anti-racist perspective. Finally, and please excuse me, Rajni, to put you in this situation, this webinar we are having today, it was an initiative of Rajni. Rajni was who contacted IESALC asking to organize a meeting with these global South scholars. It is myself. And we are having this global conversation. And also I would put Emma in a difficult situation because Emma has suggested us to do more than we are doing now. We didn't have time. Emma wanted us to try to organize a seminar more than just this webinar. And I think we will not be able to avoid Emma's challenge because Emma has also proposed us to do a second part for the next year International Day of the struggle against racism, and we have accepted. I think these are steps. I'm sure there are other steps or other processes ongoing apart from this one. And I think that it is a global problem since its origin. I say racism, modern world, colonialism is all a pack, capitalism. I think that we have organized our initiative for the eradication of racism in Latin America. And I think from now on, we can talk about a global alliance against racism in higher education. It's something I'm sure I'm seeing Rajani's face. Perhaps the audience is not seeing. It seems, very much agrees. So I think we have to walk in that direction. And thank you very much for that question suggestion. I think it's very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, I agreed with you both. Let me, because I don't actually want to finish this conversation, but I think we really, for today at least, we have to. But let me challenge everybody who's joined us today. At some point, we had 175 people here. And we know from the chat that you're joining us from many different places around the world. So let me end by asking you, participants, because I see that you share this commitment to overcoming racism, to striving towards equity in higher education. What can you take from this discussion today to your communities? What steps can you take? Because we've talked about some very concrete steps. How might those work in your contexts? Who could you share the recording of this webinar, which will be forthcoming with? On our webpage, we listed also some other reading and listening resources produced by Rajni and Daniel. Who could you share those with? Who could you help? Because it's through these small steps that we lead to bigger ideas like the one Daniel just mentioned about a global alliance to combat racism in higher education. So that's my challenge for you. And now I think, more traditional thanks to our speakers, to Daniel Mato and to Rajni Naidoo. Without you both, this would not have happened, and your cooperation and the flow of exchange between you over the last few months, you wouldn't believe that I think today is only the first time that you've seen each other, even on video. So it's just been a wonderful series of connections, and I appreciate so much the effort that you have both put in and the commitment that you both have. Now also that Daniel has publicly named some of the plans and ideas that we discussed, I think we can commit to those too. I hope that we can. Again, I'd like to thank our interpreters today, Elena Pavan Matias and Maria Perino. I'd like to thank Clarissa Yerove for facilitating the question and answers in the background, and also, of course, to our team at IESALC who work very hard behind the scenes to make everything happen. So Sara Maniero, Nes Pasamonte, Eduard Betancourt. Again, you don't see them, but they're there and making all of these things happening. So from IESALC, from the University of Bath, from UNTREF, we thank you all again for attending, for your shared commitment. At IESALC, we have 2 events coming up next week, so we hope to see you again for those. On the 23rd of November, we're running a webinar on inclusion in higher education. That's a focus on Latin America and the Caribbean in the run-up to the aforementioned World Higher Education Conference. And in 1 week today, on the 25th of November, we are launching a new report, which is based on a public consultation on the futures of higher education, which received 1,200 responses from 100 countries around the world. We've got links to those events in the chat. Again, please keep in touch with us. We work as far as possible bilingually, at least between English and Spanish. We have our website where you can find information. We're using social media. As mentioned, those of, with the email that you registered with today, we will share you the link to the video, and in due course, hopefully the exciting new podcast that we're going to create to take you with us wherever you go. So again, thank you to all the speakers, to everybody behind the scene, to our participants for co-creating much of the knowledge and the discussion that we've had today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. So thank you and goodbye.
Many, many thanks to everybody, Emma, Rajni, and all the team, and the people who have been with us. Many thanks. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been absolutely wonderful to get to know you and to just get an avenue to all the work that's been done in the region and in all the countries that you talk about. And Emma, you've just been absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And fantastic participants as well. I'm just going to try and learn Spanish before the next seminar that we have.
You can learn with me.
Many, many thanks. Goodbye.
Okay, this is great. Thank you very much, everybody.